This is Vibhuti Shah, Jaipur Dialogue USA. Today we are going to talk about specifically US India relationships in view of three very critical items around the world that are impacting and having great implications for the lives of people around the world. One is COVID, Ukraine, and the recent Taiwan. Let's dive into that straight away. And I wanted to make a mention here to all the viewers. Please subscribe, like, and support our channel. We are building a new narrative for India and the US relationships, which are very critical. I begin this today, to introduce you to two of my panelists, Dr. Nathan Punwani, who is in Arizona, a physician and very active on the Indo-American scene with a PAC that he is very sincerely and seriously involved with. And Dr. Ankit Shah, his second presence. Both of you have actually come for the second time in my show. Dr. Ankit Shah is an accountant, a lawyer, and a geopolitical analyst and observer of things. And his predictions have been rather accurate. And as we go along the show, I will request Ankit ji to tell us which of the predictions he made and what was it, the basis of which he did. So let me dive into this entire thing with a recent statement by Secretary Blinken, who said, and I quote, "There are few relationships in the world that are more vital than the one between the United States and India. We are two of the world's leading democracies, and our diversity fuels our national strength." I want Nathan to begin his thoughts on that, given that background.
Yeah, well, good morning, Vibhuti ji. It's a pleasure to be on your show today. Happy Sunday. Yeah, I think in terms of Secretary Blinken's remarks, I think it really echoes the sentiment in the United States that the U.S. India relationship can be a basis for global security in the 21st century, especially at a time of a very assertive, a very nationalistic and revanchist China that's emerging on the geopolitical scene. And I think as you see, U.S.-Chinese relations deteriorate, it seems that the U.S.-India relationship rises commensurately.
That was a remarkably short statement, and you said it very succinctly. Ankit, your comment on that. The comment with specific reference to the fact that Indo-US relationships have been talked about in much more laudatory ways, strategic partners, natural allies, and whatnot, and everything else. Has it actually fulfilled its potential and opportunity that these two democracies must combine and work towards the global peace, particularly with reference to Mrs. Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, in which she made specific references to United States promoting democracy, allies, and anti-autocratic behaviors of countries. Can we hold United States accountable and responsible for the utterances that are made? Or is it just, as we say in Hindi, naam ke waste?
So, thank you, Vibhuti ji, for giving me an opportunity to come again on this show. It's always been a pleasure discussing geopolitics here. So, on this, to begin with, something that I've particularly noted and observed, specifically from the year 2016, from the Indian external affairs, stuff, is that from Delhi, the word ally is something which has become, it's like, some kind of an instruction given from somewhere that this particular word is not to be used either for United States or Russia. So, and to begin from there, that standpoint, this different kind of terminology were devised where we call strategic partnership or comprehensive partnership, and that kind of coining of those kind of words, where Delhi is looking towards as not aligned towards a particular set of a grouping kind of a thing. And this is something which the external affairs minister, on his recent visits and to the West, clearly pointed out that it's not necessary for India to be in a particular grouping. We do have our own strategic autonomy. Now, coming to those common values which we talk about, which is democracy, the freedoms, which are kind of a Western template. Certainly, the Indian populace believes in it. The leadership believes in it, and that is how it has been for all the years. For the Indian, the diaspora as well supports these are the common values. But there is a sense among Indians as well that not that the entire world can be governed in a democracy and a freedom format, which is particularly a Western template origin. There are several countries and several crowds and communities which are not governable in an election format. And this is what we have seen in several of the American experiments which has happened in the Middle East as well, that this did not work. So this is certainly where, while we see a common ground between India and the West, but we also have this realistic view that this is not something which can be imposed on countries. So this is how I look at. Now, coming to the point where India-US relation stands, this relationship is a very important relationship in this particular century, and it has huge scope. But I am a bit disappointed after the Biden as the presidency. I mean, after Biden has sat in the White House, particularly, I mean, the last 20 months, we do not have a U.S. ambassador to Delhi, and we do not know what exactly is the roadblocker over there.
Maybe nobody wants to go there. It is like Mrs. Kamala Harris given the responsibility to manage the border, and she hasn't visited the border. She knows the trap that it is. So Indo-US relationships, Nathan, you are running a major PAC, PAC, and tell us something about what can the NRIs, what must the Indian diaspora do to make this entire play of the Indian segment with the United States? How can we contribute towards that? Nathan, for all the viewers' information, he lives in Arizona, and he's a physician. He has been in New York and very active. So tell us something about the role of the Indian diaspora. What must happen?
Yeah, so I'm one of the board of directors of the United States India Relationship Council. You can actually check us on our website, usindiarelationship.org. But one of the things that we have to really do is organize, and we need to actually start lobbying members of Congress. And the biggest thing is actually contributions. It's something that we can't be bashful about. We have to contributions to lawmakers. And one of the things that I think one of the downsides of our community is that when we do make contributions to lawmakers, it's usually just for a photo op, and we exchange some mitai, and we take a photo, a selfie, and we say that, oh, this is what we accomplished. But we actually don't go the whole way. And one of the things that we have to do is actually make it clear what are some of the things that we stand for. What are we looking for? And, as a result, we have seen a torrent of criticism of India by the United States Congress, especially by certain quarters in the more left-wing segments of the Congress. And I think part of that stems from the fact that our community actually doesn't follow up with any kind of fundraisers or events that we do and request certain criticism to be tamped down. And then, more importantly, we need to actually have an agenda, a concrete agenda, when it comes to bolstering U.S. India relations. And it needs to be along multiple dimensions, from defense, economics, boosting immigration ties. And I think it's got to be one of these multidimensional frameworks that we as a community are pushing for. The last time I feel like I saw our community unified, speaking in one coherent voice on a particular issue that I think really helped escalate U.S.-India relations to the next level was really in 2006, 7, 8, when we had the U.S.-India nuclear deal, the civil nuclear deal, when we actually did see the community come out in droves. I think that was actually the first time I ever called a member of Congress asking him to vote for the U.S. India nuclear deal. So I think we need really. I think since then we haven't really seen much on the policy front crystallize, and I think that's what the diaspora has to do.
I by and large, I totally agree with you. Other than in the recent past, that there has been some, greater involvement, if not activism, from the Indian community in the United States, particularly towards making a mark. By and large, we have been apathetic, and we are the kind of people who are very satisfied with what we are doing and not concerned with the rest of the matter. Even Indians in India consider NRIs as not required Indians. It's only lately that people have begun to realize that we are a new responsible Indians. So the point of the matter is that we need to take that step forward. What must happen? Because we are such a diverse community that to find the element that unites us are very few, and because everybody holds a divergent view. So, Ankit, from the domestic Indian perspective, what do you think that NRIs must do to come as a united force, to make an impact in American political scene?
So one of the primary things with the diaspora can do, and I agree here with Nathan, that they need to have concrete agenda items, and there are variety of domains where India and US can collaborate, right? If you talk about defense, what is the roadblocker over there? I mean, India is from a defense customer point of view, we are 100 billion plus dollar potential customer. So where is the roadblocker? The roadblocker talks about uh, the tech transfer and joint production. So there are several avenues. You talk about economics. Uh, it's Everyone is aware that in the 70s and 80s it was the training of the West that the CCP cadres had, the Chinese Communist Party cadres and the Chinese people, that this entire giant economic machine that has China has become. So a lot of these can be shifted to the Indian bases. These are the point areas where we can collaborate a lot of Indian resources. I mean, all the countries of the world are gradually aging. We have the youngest population over here, so diaspora can certainly give a direction to the US businesses and these things to collaborate more over here. So the points of collaboration are a lot. Diaspora does require a kind of orientation, should I say. It's not that they are not willing. uh, a kind of orientation is something which I see as a gap. If orientation is given, the diaspora can bring the two countries together.
Who will give that orientation? And the second part is that when you talk about a very valid issue of roadblocks and what are the blockages in developing that military relationship and defense production and intellectual property transfer, where is the problem from the Indian side? Let's talk about that. We need to look at ourselves too. Blaming USA is a global occupation for everybody. That I know. It's a global occupation. Blame America for everything that happens. But from the Indian point of view, and I want to know that because I came here for the business promotion part of it, what are the roadblocks that India puts in the path? And are they actually roadblocks or is it a political play?
I believe uh, since independence, we always have had a kind of a socialist tinge, from businesses to how we were governing the stuff, despite the
Just
Western
one minute. Either
democracy.
one
And
of you have your phone on, so kindly mute it. One of you, please. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Ankit.
yeah, so we had this socialist method of doing businesses and that kind of stuff post independence, despite the democracy format of the West. And from 1991, as we all know, that we have liberalized, privatized and globalized the economy, and now we are opening up more to the world. But this sense of a lack of trust factor still prevails in the Indian governance, should I say, uh, if that is a word. Lack of trust, because we have seen time and again, whenever it comes to those concerns which India had, say, be it about terrorism, we have never seen the kind of support that India always expected from the West, because it's the West, it's the Western template of freedoms and democracy that we talk about, which is being attacked by the terrorist forces. So there are many roadblocks where the trust factor goes missing with the West. Sometimes, if you are going for defense purchases, as I said, that the roadblocker is tech transfer. Now, what exactly is a roadblocker? I mean, if you break it down from tech transfer perspective, it is lack of trust, right? So there is a lack of trust from both sides, and this can be bridged if the leaders from both the communities, not the diaspora and the Indian community side, and also not just the people to people exchanges, but leader to leader exchanges. So as I pointed out, there is no much movement going on between the external affairs between the two nations, especially the last 1.5 years. I seriously do not know where it is stuck. And also with respect to the kind of exit which US had from Afghanistan, uh, the kind of treatment which Ukraine has seen. I mean, it's just supply of arms, right? So, and right now, after Nancy Pelosi has left Taiwan, um, it is encircled by the Chinese military staff. So it just almost feels like that the allies are just thrown to fend off for themselves. This is where the lack of trust comes into play.
Trust is a very, very key word. It defines every relationship. Nathan, I will piggyback on Ankit's reference to one very important element: terrorism, international terrorism. So the point of the matter remains is here is that terror in somewhere along the line, and it's so rather unfortunate that Islamic world has somehow succeeded in internationalizing terrorism as a negotiation tool and taking advantage of the rule of law and democracies. Just today, I read an article which said that videos have emerged that in Texas, children, Muslim children, have been taking oath to be martyrs for Iran's supreme leader, and at the Islamic Education Center of Houston, right? And they were glowing terms. It was going on. This is August 6th, yesterday. It was reported. It is all over. If you want, I'll share that article with you guys. Somewhere along the line, it's very, very disturbing for me that how terrorism has become an international tool of negotiation. At the same time, those people claim victimhood too. They blame you and I for being in that situation that they are. And this is one of the common denomination factor on which India and United States can and must work together, because we both are remarkably huge victims of this. India for a long time, in US did not pay attention to that until the tragedy of 9/11 happened here. So Nathan, frankly speaking, truthfully speaking, honestly speaking, how must the United States prevent this rise of global terrorism happening on its own soil?
Yeah. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the United States has to hold terrorist sponsoring nations accountable. And that's something that the U.S. has an inconsistent track record. If you take Pakistan, for example, a country that has really subsidized, created an industry out of terrorism, with respect to India and, Afghanistan. The United States always had an inconsistency when it came to managing relations. On the one hand, they wanted Pakistan to stabilize Afghanistan. And on the other hand, and as a result, it really required the U.S. to look the other way. The same thing earlier during the Cold War, the United States viewed Pakistan as a client state. The United States viewed Pakistan as a client state during the Cold War. So as a result, what did it do? It overlooked the issue of terrorism. The United States so conveniently frets about terrorism when it affects their interests in, for example, the Middle East, when it comes to, Saudi Arabia, if there's any threats to the global flow of crude oil. So, at the end of the day, I think one of the biggest things with terrorism is that it's a peripheral issue until it becomes a domestic issue. And that's why you could see sometimes a divergence in response by the United States against terrorism.
On the other hand, it is also very important is that how the system of democracy, the freedom, element of freedom, how it gets abused by people who do not subscribe to the concept of freedom. Your word on that. And Ethan, feel free to comment on it. Take your time. Comment on that.
Can you elaborate further on?
What I mean to say is that there is a thing called freedom. We democracies love our freedoms. U.S. Constitution openly says in the preamble, pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. Right? Nothing can. This is a classic Sanatan thing that is borrowed in the U.S. Constitution. My point is very simple here: is that are the enemies of democracy, are the enemies of United States and India and the democracies around the world taking undue advantage and manipulating the entire freedom to their advantage? Because communists and fanatics of any faith do not practice the freedom.
Yeah, unfortunately, freedom is one of those things where, on the one hand, a democracy has to allow the rights of people to air unpopular views, unpopular concepts, and yes, fanatical concepts. On the other hand, democracies have to also they have a vested interest in securing themselves, securing their populace. And I think one of the things that we're seeing, the problem with this is in recent years, the rise of a woke leftist agenda, where you actually have people who are spouting out critical race theory, they're spouting out concepts in which people that are perceived to be more persecuted than others, they have more moral worth, and therefore they have a right to speak, and they have a right to harbor incorrigible views. I mean, very abhorrent views. So in this case, when it comes to more radical Islamic elements that may live in Western countries, because they're deemed to be a community that is subjected to a lot of persecution, racism, and discrimination, and I'm not denying that, but because they were perceived that way, as a result, they're given extra moral worth, extra moral credit, and thus leeway to hold, views that, are much more receptive to fundamentalism. And I think that's something that you're saying. And I think that's as a result, because the Indian American community, especially Hindus in the United States, we aren't viewed as a persecuted class. And if you're not viewed as persecuted class, then you have less moral worth. There's kind of a totem pole of morality that mirrors the degree of persecution you're perceived to have endured. And I think that's one of the things that you're seeing in a lot of these democracies is this kind of woke mentality, where anyone who is persecuted, you can't criticize them. It's hands off. You had to treat them with baby gloves, and I'd argue that's the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Very well said. Guys, one of you have to keep your phone completely out of your range, because one of the Vivek says here that cell phones must be kept away from the speaker, then only whoever it is. So let's try that. Okay. Coming to this issue, that's a very important point Nathan brought in, is the point that where you have to be feeling persecuted, the wokeism, and things like that. Important element here is that somewhere along the line, it is extremely important to bear in mind that, reciprocity is the need of the hour. Freedoms we cherish. Demanding reciprocity for a mutual respect and conduct is key. Life is not a one-way traffic. It has to be both ways. If you want to criticize me, then be willing to face the criticism. And in that reference, one of the Congress ladies from United States has brought about an Islamophobia bill, which completely talks about what is known as blasphemy. You can't even ask a question. That puts freedom of speech in a direct conflict with the religious freedom element. So the issue here is very critical. Freedom of speech, in my definition of things, is very simple, is the ability to ask a question, to get to know something more. It's only when you have the ability to ask and make an inquiry that change happens, innovations happens, discoveries happen. That's how transformation happens. How do you think that the democratic world deal with the issue of blasphemy versus the freedom of speech? Ankit, you go.
So this particular Western template of democracy and freedoms, and specifically this particular word, secularism. Now, these has come from the Western templates. So we need to understand that when we talk about elections, the fundamental assumption we are having is that every voter is going to vote rationally. All right. Now, there's another element which we talked about, which is freedom of religion. Now, freedom of religion should have kind of exceptions, one of which should be public order, public safety. All right. So now, if there is an exercise of freedom of religion which is going to harm or injure some other citizen of yours of the same country, then certainly, there is an infringement of some other particular right or freedom which is enshrined in the constitution. So I believe that this particular format will need a kind of evolving. Right now, if you look at Europe, now this particular concept of secularism the debates have started. These debates have started because somewhere the natives have a feeling that the illegal crowds and immigrants are doing demographic changes. They are taking over. They are not as much assimilating as they were expected to, right? And this would lead to some kind of a confrontation a few decades down the line with the native Europeans. So, this particular concept of secularism, where it rooted from this base thought that the church and the state has to be different, right? The church should not infringe upon the boundaries of the state, and the state should not be infringing upon the boundaries of the church, right? So this is where it rooted from. But now, when we also give this particular a free run to the freedom to practice religion, it slowly got converted into something called propagation of religion, and then conversion, and then mob objectives of taking over demographies. uh, uh, Blanket separation of treatment between believers and non-believers. That is the kind of boundaries that it has reached. So certainly these are the concepts needs to be discussed more, and the state has to improve its governance based on the new threats which are coming up.
Nathan, Ankit is making a very valid point that the states have to emerge and confront the challenge. Do you think it's time for India, to borrow Ankit's phrase, Western template? Is it time for India to abandon some of the Western templates? For example, the freedom of religion. Hindu practices are absolute. Hinduism is Sanatana is one of the most liberal democratic way of life and practice. We don't impose conditions, though we don't impose mandates. You are free to pray, not to free to pray. Do whatever you like, so long as you are still doing good to the communities and societies. Your karma, your actions define you, not how many times you prayed and whatever you did. Do you think it's time for India to say no conversion? Freedom of religion, yes, but no conversion, because in my humble opinion, I always say this, that conversion is probably a greatest sin against God's original intent. God's original intent, Ankit is Ankit, Vibhuti is Vibhuti, Nathan is Nathan. One is Punwani, other is Shah, other is Jha. If God was the ultimate, is the ultimate magician, he could have made each one of us belonging to a different faith, but he didn't. So as people, when we talk about conversion to a particular sect or religion, is it a sin against God's original intent? And must India take that step? Freedom of religion, yes. Freedom to convert, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. First of all, I say this as
Beginning of transforming the template.
yeah. I say this as a second generation Indian American. I never even lived in India, although I have very close family in India, and I go every couple of years. At the end of the day, I think India has to come up with a model of government and society that actually comports with with its indigenous values, its civilizational values, and it's thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. So to expect it to copy and really mimic Western democracy in every minuta is impractical. It's unrealistic, and I think India has to, at the end of the day, do what it thinks is best for India, and that's what I expect any country to do. I think on a deeper level, though, I think one could argue that is India even implementing or even doing the right kinds of adopting the right kinds of Western values and even implementing those correctly. So I think a great example is truly the concept of secularism. One could argue India isn't really a secular country. The fact that you don't have a uniform civil code, that's the pillar of Western civilization, is a uniform civil code that applies to all a country's citizens, irrespective of religion. I would argue that is true secularism. That and that is the kind of secularism that Voltaire, one of the Enlightenment philosophers, would have opted for. But instead, what India did is a more distorted, bastardized version of secularism, which I would say is more pluralism, and that's I think a euphemism. But it's India's sense is that you have to accommodate all religions. At least this is the Nehruvian sense of government, and their Nehruvian interpretation of secularism is that you have to accommodate all religions, all faiths, and whatever their customs are, you have to accept it and incorporate it into legal code. And I think that's actually would be risible in any Western court of law. It's laughable. How can you enforce civil conduct but allow it to vary based on what a person's faith is? And I think that's actually impedes secularism. That's actually what stokes more division than anything else. So I think at the end, to sum it all up, I don't even think India's correctly adopting or implementing Western principles. I think what India did is, at least back in 1947, when it gained independence from Britain, was that it implemented a very distorted version of Western concepts and values. And I think at the end of the day, what India has to do is overhaul its legal code. And I hope in the coming years they adopt some form of judicial reforms, and really now start developing its own common law practices and civil code that I think comports better with its indigenous values, its timeless indigenous values.
Oh, very well said. Ankit, I will piggyback on that particular issue of uniform civil code, and secularism was inserted in the Indian constitution during the infamous emergency, where the only man in the Indian government, which was Indira Gandhi, in the Congress party, she imposed her will and all the lackeys voted for it. So it's a very valid point that secularism as practiced is failing in India. Do you think, what is holding back the Modi government from bringing about a uniform civil code? Because what is important, that will also test India's true friends. If at that time, if the international media begins to talk about curbing religious rights of minorities, then we know who our friends are and who our enemies are. So what's holding back Prime Minister Modi from bringing about uniform civil code for all people?
I hold a very different perspective on this, because I believe that it's botched up. The whole document is botched up from the beginning. We were given a punctured engine to start with our train in 1947 itself.
That was a transfer of power. It was not actually independence either. That was a very clear documentation there.
Yeah.
Transfer of power. Right. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. And secularism and secular and socialist, these were the two words added during emergency, right? So this particular word secularism does not apply to India specifically, because the church and the mosques in the West, where this concept came in, they used to interfere with the kings. In India, the temples or the mandirs never interfered with the state. So we particularly never required this particular word. Now, as far as coming back to this particular document, constitution is concerned, there are a lot many things boshed up here. The very first word that is boshed up is religion, because all the four Indian dharmas, which are, I mean, Indian origin, not foreign origin religions, they are diagonally opposite to the religions in many, many ways. Uh, Dharmas are all encompassing. It doesn't have, what we call as a philosophy of, adesh, the commandments that to be a believer, you have to believe the set of rules and implement the set of rules. Then and then only you are a believer. So this comes from the Abrahamic thought process, which are foreign origin religions. Dharmas are diagonally opposite. We are looking for individual liberation. The religions are a set of beliefs which the entire mob has to believe in, which is not the case with dharmas. Religions believe in exclusivity of treatment between believers and non-believers. This does not happen with the four Indian dharmas. Religions come with the concept of God and follower. I believe the Bhagwan which we have is not about the follower kind of a concept. If you can have one God, you can have 10 gods, you can have no God, and you can still be a Hindu, right? So the all four Indian dharmas are completely different. Religions talk about God fearing life. Dharmas is about karma fearing life. We are diagonally opposite. Religions are talking about only one life concept, which is why there is a sense of toxic individualism and toxic consumerism in the other parts of the world. Whereas over here we are talking about individual liberation. We are not talking about one life concept. We have life cycles. The Bhagwans come every year. Again, they are submerged into water and they are also reborn. So we give death to them as well, and they are also reborn. So we have this life cycles. So I believe that religion and dharmas are totally different. And until and unless, when we talk about the word swatantra, which is self-governance, until the native population has its place in that particular document, which we call as constitution, which is a man-made document and gets amended, which means it's not sacrosanct, obviously. So until we get a place over there, certainly India does not stake a claim uh, worldwide in the committee of countries uh, for these four dharmas that has Indian origin. So I believe a lot of things are botched up. Our mandirs and temples are completely different. Temples are for the worship concept and the prayer concept. Prayer comes from the root of asking things, right? Whereas Indian dharmas cannot be asking materialistic things, right? Because you're looking for liberation, right? So I think a lot of things are botched up. Mandir is completely different. It's a place where you elevate your inner self. It is not for worship. Now, what the West says idol worship, it's not actually what we are doing over here. The Bhagwan is actually the pran pratishtha of the supreme value which you are trying to invoke, right? It's not some idol worship. So I think the Western template has had its run a lot over here, and India has to get back to its roots.
Thank you very much. Very well said. I just wanted to make the statement. Is that the reason why the some famous poet said the East is East and West is West and the twain shall never meet? Nathan, how do you react to what Ankit said? That is it time for India to reestablish its own credentials in the
Yeah.
Western world? How do we go about it?
And I think India has to reestablish its own credentials. I think each civilizational power it's foolish to think that they can identically clone a model from another civilization and engraft it onto its own. It never ever really works all that well. And I think when you do that, when you try to impose a set of values, principles, and governing structures on an indigenous population, you're bound to develop some kind of internal strife. And you can see many times it provokes a bigger backlash down the road, as you can see in Turkey when, Ataturk imported kind of Western governance, secularism, and now there's a bigger backlash against it now with Erdogan. Now Islamicism has become even more popular than it ever has been. So I think this is the kind of issues that you actually encounter whenever you import a different governance model onto another populace, and especially a populace with derived from a completely different civilization. And I think, just to put it on another point, I think inserting socialist into the Indian constitution, I think at the end of the day, there was nothing Hindu or Indian about India's dalliance with socialism. This was a flawed Western import that was, brought into India and was implemented and led to really unprecedented poverty. That I would argue was never ever part of India's civilizational fabric. If you just look at it, it was a very dramatic rupture from antiquity. If you go all the way to Chanakya with the Arthashastra, they always said the root of wealth is economic activity, and a king should remove obstructions to economic activity. One could argue this is something that Adam Smith would have said, but this was actually said by India's civilizational forefathers. And the Mauryan and Gupta dynasties, they actually established trade routes as far as China and the Roman Empire, and the Chola rulers were renowned for their commercial and maritime prowess. And they even say there's an imperial directive that says make merchants of distant countries attached to yourself by allowing them profits. So Indian civilization was always receptive to private enterprise, and and that actually what made it renowned for its unbridled prosperity. India had 1/4 of the world's GDP back in the classical days. And you can see that, and you can see when you then import a foreign governance model like socialism, which was totally, antithetical to Indian values, and you engraft it on Indian society. What did it lead? It led to economic growth, 1.8% each year for 5 decades, or actually 3 decades after independence. And I would argue this is what happens when you impose a foreign concept on an indigenous population.
As a student of economics, I can tell you there was India had been infamous for what was known as the Hindu rate of growth.
Yeah.
Remember that? And
there was nothing Hindu about it.
Nothing Hindu about it, right?
It was all Fabian socialism
by the fake Gandhis and the fake Nehruvian philosophies. But coming back to one of the most critical issues of Indo-US relationship is the China role. And we know what has happened in Ukraine. Ankit said that other than supplying weapons, there is nothing else. In the case of Taiwan, for example, Nancy Pelosi has made very strong statements about opposing autocratic rules, establishing rule of law and democracy. Now, there is a thought process that is China's war games, particularly in Taiwan, their global belligerence. Must it become a warning to the private enterprise and the corporates of America as to how actually China governs itself and how it treats people who do not agree with them on the same lines? Is it time for people and the global business order to begin a re-evaluation of their desire to have low-cost production in China and maximum profit for itself? Because then there is an element of social good and the political reality. Where does this come in, and how must the world respond to that? Ankit, you go first.
So, as I believe that the entire democracy and the Western freedoms format are actually sponsored by the torture of the Chinese labor. So, when the West begins making things at home, that is the point in time when the West will realize that you can have freedoms and democracies and talk about literature and all those things, but the struggle is real if you want to have those supply chains and manufacturing and back home without pollution and those kind of things and after effects of exploiting the resources, including labor, right? So if the West is serious about it, it's going to take decades for the West to set up those supply chains and manufacturing. If they want to shift out from profits and focus on the values which the West talks about predominantly for decades now. So it's going to be a test for the West the coming days, especially with the winter setting in. A lot of European nations will be cut off from their supplies coming from Russia, China, and the Asian region. And it is going to be a test for NATO and particularly for the United States on how it's going to support the Western allies when these supplies are gone. So it's going to be a test because West has, destroyed its own supply chain and manufacturing in order to build the Chinese Communist Party. So you will have to face it now.
Face it now. But there is another very interesting issue. As the saying goes, that you can't keep two swords in the same sheath. China has been playing a very smart game. They know that they will survive Japan, an economically prosperous Japan, which, today the world is a couple of $100 trillion. Combined wealth of the world is about over $100 trillion, which China and the US are 2 and 1. The issue here is very important to supply chain, global interdependence. Doesn't China recognize that it has become a pariah nation in the world? Nobody likes China anymore. Not their strong arm tactics, not their killer contracts. Doesn't the Chinese realize that Chinese Z, particularly Mr. Zittler, as he is known now, that he can't become as Hitler and try to impose his will on the modern world? It's critical also for the simple reason that the world has begun to recognize. I read an article by a Korean in one of the magazines just yesterday, and it said it is world's responsibility to ensure that India is not hurt because of Chinese actions. There is a organization called Captive Nations Coalition of the Committee on Present Danger, which against China. And they have said it is a global responsibility to protect, because they know that if China is able to kind of an impact India adversely, it will have a domino effect on the rest of Asia and the world. And that is, the laws of physics are coming into operation, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? That's what I'm trying to ask here, is it time for the rest of the world to confront China, and India itself must rise to confront the Chinese evil? Because their strategy is very simple. They just keep hitting you and they wait for your submission. They drag down the approach that China has. Keep nibbling on the territories. Eventually, the people will give up. Nathan.
Yeah. Well, I think on one of the questions, the United States, India, really the rest of the world has to be more engaged, and they got to make their economies more competitive. I think one of the things with India is if India wants to benefit and become the beneficiary of reshoring and the restructuring of global supply chains to be reoriented and integrated with India, India also has to do its part, like, implement labor reforms, further tax reforms and deregulatory reforms. So I think those are the agenda items that need to be implemented. In the case of the United States, I think what was going to be included in the recent CHIPS bill. So this was this $50 billion subsidy package to reinvigorate the U.S. semiconductor industry and to build more factories, semiconductor microchip factories in the United States. One of the provisions that didn't make it in the final legislation was a provision that would have screened any outbound United States investment into China, especially in things that were deemed to be, critical supply chains. And I think, it's this kind of provision that I think would have ensured that U.S. investment was actually going to strengthen allied supply chains and not strengthen the the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that was a missed opportunity. But it does go to show that there is increased sentiment in the United States Congress for toughening sanctions on China and toughening just the free flow of investment into China, that it's not going to be so free. And I think, as Neil Ferguson, as a very bright English scholar, had said, he said, Chimerica is heading for a divorce, this symbiosis between China and the United States, in which Chinese excess savings was getting funneled into U.S. debt, U.S. Funding the excessive consumption binge of the United States. That economic model that defined the global order in the 1990s and 2000s, that is heading towards a divorce. And I think when you see proposals to screen outbound investment into China, and this is backed by Democrats and Republicans, it tells you there's a change in the wind here.
Good to know that. Good to hear that. And that the winds of change will have to come, because there is no choice about that. You said what Mr. Ferguson said, that Chimerica is heading towards a divorce. Perhaps United States and China were one of the classiest examples of politics makes strange bedfellows. So whatever they had, intended to gain on the economic side, they have gained. They have made China what it is. Ankit, I wanted to check with you on this element of Taiwan, and two issues on Taiwan and Ukraine that I wanted to touch upon. How do you see Chinese belligerence in Taiwan affecting or shaping or reshaping India-US relationship?
So, as I told you before itself, that there's a lack of coordination on this front, be it Ukraine or Taiwan. The collaboration between India and United States is missing. It can be clearly seen, and there is a deafening silence of India on the Taiwan issue. I mean, there's no statement. I mean,
And so it was on Ukraine as well. India took a very different approach. We'll talk about that separately. But you are right. Yeah.
So there's a deafening silence, because somewhere my reading is that it's the Russia, India, China format which is building up. And there is a tendency towards de-dollarization of the world in the greater scheme of things which countries are working towards. Which is why I see that this gap is widening further and further, which is why I keep on stressing that we still don't have a US ambassador in India. Because, I mean, if you want to have the communication lines open, and if you're looking for a good strategic partnership, this is the minimum which a big country like India, I mean, it's going to be the largest population in the world, this particular country. And we have been skipped out from the United Nations Security Council. I mean, we deserve the seat over there. So I believe it's something where Russia and China are trying to fill in the space when US is missing. This is exactly what happened during past few years in the Middle East. The US went missing, and India and Israel have taken to call the shots, be it Saudi Arabia or UAE or on the Iran issue. So as many areas of international interest, the United States is going to leave the space empty. Some or the other powers are going to fill in those. Now, when you talk about this particular divorce, which the CCP and the US, I mean, it's going to be the case because it's no longer the Chinese Communist Party. It's now a Xi Jinping party, right? So the divorce is very obvious over here, because that particular consultative method with which China was functioning is now no more existing. So this divorce is obvious. Now, if you look at where we are heading towards in terms of Taiwan, definitely some action is coming, because there's a Congress which Xi Jinping is going to face. He's going to take up the third term over there. And definitely US will back with some kind of sanctions. And as soon as some sanctions come, you will see that the de-dollarization process will actually fasten up instead of slowing down. So I do not know why United States is going down that suicidal path, but this is what is going to happen, because countries after countries are signing up for de-dollarization. I mean, I just heard Turkey has agreed trading in Russian ruble with Russia. You have Saudi Arabia doing an oil deal in yuan with China. You have Russian deal with India in UAE currency dirham. Iran is already under sanctions. Russia is under sanctions. The ruble is performing good. China is going to take some action over there in Taiwan, and definitely sanctions will come. So what I'm looking at, Israel replaced its forex reserves, a big chunk of US dollars with yuan. The BRICS countries are making a common currency format. 5 Southeast Asian countries, South China Sea countries, made up a common currency platform, removing US dollar out of that. India has signed up deal with Iran, Myanmar. Uh, France is also ready for a UPI. About 30 countries lining up for UPI with India. So slowly and gradually, what I'm seeing is, and France, by the way, is being assured by UAE that their supplies won't be hampered. Greece is assured by Saudi Arabia that their supplies are not going to be hampered. So in a way, what I'm seeing is a big alliance coming up for de-dollarization. And it's particularly going to happen because United States, I don't know, is simply unable to match the speed with which countries are moving, or maybe um, they have just lost it. I mean, the countries are moving towards de-dollarization. The SEO format, where we have a summit next month in Samarkand, there will be some declaration on, again, national currencies trade format. I don't know where the United States is.
That's a very ominous declaration that you have made, an observation which seems very real, because nobody likes to be sanctioned. And sadly enough, although the sanction came on Russia, as you rightly pointed out, the ruble is doing well, and the dependency on Russian energy of Europe is very, very clear. Coming
Chilly
to the
winter coming
Ukraine,
in.
I'm sorry,
It's going to be chilly winter for the West.
chilly winter for the West.
It's going to be right around Christmas time, I have a feeling.
Coming to that element, I wanted to also touch upon Ukraine. And I look at it from a very different perspective about Ukraine and why the rest of the world need not worry. Although the death of people, the destruction of Ukraine cannot be applauded, it is a despicable thing to happen. I believe, personally speaking, that Russia must stop now. I mean, that if you have not achieved your objective in as many days, there is definitely something wrong about your objective. Perhaps, maybe you want to capture certain areas of eastern Ukraine and whatever, and geopolitical part, but this has gone on too long. But my take on this matter is, we have 4 minutes, so I'll make the statement and I'll seek both of you to comment on that. The only continent in the world is Europe that plays an emotional, melodramatic territorial adjustments from time to time. And I call it melodramatic territorial adjustments because that's the history of Europe. They have always fought within each other to capture someone's territory and expand. German unification, Italian unification, Yugoslavia is gone, Czechoslovakia is gone, USSR is broken, and it goes on in Europe. And that somehow becomes a global problem. They convert it into a global problem. The First World War and Second World War, they were essentially domestic dispute of Europe, their territorial battle. And imperial powers brought in the imperial countries, and our soldiers lost their lives, Indian soldiers lost their lives, and every colony lost their lives there for European battle. Ukraine is a similar dilemma. NATO is nothing else, but as somebody said in a very disparaging way, that is nothing else but a white man's war club. No other continent has a NATO kind of an agreement. So there is something seriously wrong in Europe. It is a dramatic, play of their own melodrama they play from time to time. It's not a global problem. What's your take on it? Let it be handled by that. Why must India not take care of its own interest, just as we in America say, that our presidents always say, and our politicians say, that America is working for its people and American interests. Nothing wrong in it. But why shouldn't other countries do that then? Nathan, you go first, and then Ankit.
I mean, I think well, yeah, actually, and I think realpolitik is something that defines each country, and I think each country is going to have to follow whatever its strategic interests are, and it would be wrong to expect otherwise. As for the Ukraine specifically, though, I think it's a natural geopolitical flashpoint, largely because it sits on a civilizational fault line, as Samuel Huntington had said back when he wrote The Clash of Civilizations. He said Ukraine in the 90s would naturally, somewhere in the road, would lead to some kind of flashpoint between kind of the war Western Christendom, as he called it, as encapsulated by the United States and Western Europe, versus kind of the Slavic Orthodox traditions, and Ukraine was somewhere in that middle. And it was this a geopolitical no man's land, and unfortunately, without good fences, you don't always get good neighbors.
Ankit?
Well, I think this last 300, 400 years, Europe has had its time where, I mean, you call it a continent, but it's not actually a continent, right? So it has had, it's not a continent status, by the way. So anyways, so it has imposed on itself the continent status because of the last 300 years of dominance that it had and colonies world over. So it is obvious that it's going to lose that status. Now, coming back to your Ukraine crisis, there are many reasons for it. One is obvious, which we see is the USSR breakdown, and then this kind of feeling in Russia that we have to gain back the loss that we suffered. And then there is also an element of conflict of orthodoxy between the Western and the Russian Moscowite churches. That conflict also exists on ground. Then there is another reason, which is the U.S. deep state script of keeping the U.S. dollar running as a reserve currency status of the world, where a bucket of nations faces sanctions, another bucket of nations gets dollars and arms, kind of a thing. And then there is a fourth factor, which is, I mean, I'll go back to history, where a Ruthenian lady was dragged to Istanbul as a slave, and she went on to become the first Haseki Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and which later had Mehmet and Sahin Garay, which are the Crimean princes, actually a second in line to the Ottoman throne of Sultan Ahmed Khan Hazrat Litre. So these were also the descendants of the Genghis Khan in Mongolia. So in a way, Turkey versus Mongolia also playing out in this particular conflict. So these are the bottom layers of what we see on ground in Ukraine. So these are the things which has happened. But overall, as we see that Russia, India, and China, some of the Asian biggies now see that they have to they take back the ground which they lost in terms of the weight in global politics, which is why you see that Ukraine, Taiwan, and you never know when Pakistan occupied Kashmir becomes an attempt. So.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, both of you. Very invigorating and enlightening conversation. I enjoyed it. I hope the viewers enjoyed it, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. So my takeaways are very simple. India needs UCC. India needs to look at the Western template of democracy that we have, copied and pasted, literally or so. And thank you very much for both of you to convey your thoughts. Viewers, like, subscribe, and support our channel. We will keep bringing exciting conversation to have. Namaste, and I always say, Satyamev Jayate, truth must prevail. Truth always prevails. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.